Okay, hello and welcome to this. It's a bit of a rehearsal of a presentation that I'm going to be giving on February 26th. That's, I guess, tomorrow as I record this um, at NYU. I'll be co-teaching a class with Joseph LeDoux. He's teaching his course, The Emotional Brain at NYU, and they're doing one class on consciousness. And so Joe and I are going to co-teach this class. This really stems out of work that Joe and I have done together. Our paper first came out in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences last year, where we try to develop a higher order theory of emotional consciousness, extending some ideas from Joe's work and also from my own work, and trying to combine them. And this really came from um, our desire to try to get these two separate conversations um, about consciousness really together. So on the one hand, there's the work on neuroscience of emotions, which we've gone on for a long time. And on the other hand, there's work on the theories of consciousness, which has gone on since at least the late 90s in a serious sort of way. And these two conversations seem to reduplicate each other. So what Joe noticed was that he was having a lot of the same debates with his colleagues in emotion science as other people were having in consciousness studies. So we try to combine those two things, and that's what's going to come out of today. Now, I must say that as I record this, if it sounds a little bit hushed, that's because things are trying to be a bit quiet around my house right now. We have a sleeping 3-year-old downstairs and a 2-week-old, just welcome addition to our family. So everyone is quiet. It's very early in the morning, and I'm trying to run through a rehearsal of this. So we'll see how this works out. Now, the first thing that we might want to talk about is why are we talking about consciousness in a neuroscience class? And of course, this is a welcome new thing which has happened in the last 20 years or so. Consciousness has become a serious topic of study, and it always has been of interest, obviously, to people and to philosophers. This conversation about consciousness extends at least back to Descartes in the 17th century, if not further back, but at least back there, where we start um, recognizing a lot of the themes which we're still discussing and having debates about today. So representation, um, the mind representing external properties, what's the nature of these properties that the mind uses to represent the external properties. Is the mind physical or not? What's introspective access to the mind? What's the connection between physical stimuli and mental states and behavior? So these are things that Descartes was interested in trying to explain. And of course, he wasn't doing empirical science. He thought there was no empirical science of the mind. You can do empirical science of physical objects, he thought, but not of these non-physical things like minds. And things have changed a lot since in the roughly 370 years or whatever it's been since the 1640s. And now in the year 2018, the neuroscience of consciousness is vying to be just like any other branch of neuroscience. And I think the kind of guiding idea is that they would like to be much like what happened with the attention folks. So attention used to be, something obviously that psychologists were interested in. William James talks about it as a history. People did some stuff, but it wasn't a major area of research until the 90s or so. And then they were able to operationally define what attention was. They did a bunch of empirical work, a lot of data, and now it's an area where it's thriving. You can work in someone's lab studying attention, get a job studying attention, create your own lab, continuing work on attention. And so the idea is that we want the neuroscience of consciousness to end up in roughly the same position, where there are people who study consciousness scientifically, who are training other people to do it, who then go on to get jobs. And so um, at this point, there really are two main conferences where consciousness is the central topic. There are always conferences where it comes up, but these are the main ones, I would say. And the first is the one known as the science of consciousness. It was formerly called Towards the Science of Consciousness, but it was started in 1994. Here's this year's poster in April of 2018. You can see that the poster sort of indicates the general idea that there's a lot of speculation going on here. So here's this floating brain going into this black hole type thing. And the Tucson conferences have a big tent kind of philosophy. So there are people there who discuss neuroscience and cognitive scientific approaches to consciousness, but also people who talk about idealism and panpsychism. It's associated with the Journal of Consciousness Studies. That doesn't publish that journal. The journal's independent, but the journal often publishes summaries of what goes on at the conference. So I presented at this conference. It's amazing because even though there's such a wide diversity of people with such extremely different views, you tend to sort of find those who with interests like yours. And to be honest, I think it's always healthy to be exposed to some of these more speculative ideas. But if you're looking for where the more neuroscientific, focused discussion of consciousness takes place, then you want to check out the Association for the Scientific Study of Consciousness. And that, again, is a body that goes back to the 90s, organized by a lot of the same people, actually, just looking for something that was more focused on the neuroscience, the cognitive science of consciousness, with less of the speculative stuff, although not none of it, but less of it. And so they were publishing a journal for a long time called Psyche. That went defunct, and it's been rebranded. Now they have a new journal called Neuroscience of Consciousness, which is, I think, edited by N.L. Seth. So the Association for Scientific Study of Consciousness is another one of these conferences that I've presented at. It's a very different conference. It's in its orientation. But this year's conference is being held in Poland. It's very international. In fact, Joe LeDoux will be presenting this year. So I recommend those who are interested to see for themselves what the science of consciousness is looking like nowadays. Then please check out the ASSC. It's an extremely friendly conference, well worth checking out. Moving on then, why we're talking about neuroscience of consciousness in a neuroscience class is because the neuroscience of consciousness is a thriving area with some serious work. And I want to introduce you to that today in the context of emotion science. So before doing that, though, if we're talking about consciousness, we have to say what we mean by it. And this is a difficult thing to do because it's hard to define. It's a fundamental concept, and fundamental concepts are often tricky to define because they're so fundamental, especially in something like the case of consciousness. But even so, there are many different ways that people use the term consciousness. And so we would need to try to disambiguate it so that we don't talk past each other. So what I want to do is talk about what the main sense that that philosophers have thought consciousness should be discussed in, and then some other senses, and then how they relate to each other. Okay, so before we talk about specific theories, that's roughly my plan. So the basic notion that we want to try to theoretically get a handle on can be called phenomenal consciousness. And this is a term that was introduced in the 90s by Ned Block, but it's something that goes back a lot longer than that, at least as far back as Thomas Nagel in the 1970s. So here's a picture of Nagel. I don't know when this picture was taken, but here's him teaching a class, and Thomas Nagel famously wrote a paper in the late 60s, early 70s, where he asked the question, what is it like to be a bat? So his idea was that when there's consciousness, there's something that it's like for the creature. So there's a particular way that things are from the first person point of view. And, there are ways of clarifying what this means that appeal to common sense. So if you've never tasted pineapple, then you don't know what pineapple tastes like, right? You don't know what it's like to taste a pineapple. There's a property which you aren't able to know about because you haven't had the relevant experience. And that's a kind of common sense idea. Or again, think about it more abstractly. Think about your experience right now. You're sitting somewhere, presumably listening to my voice, looking around, having your own personal thoughts, and you may compare what's going on internally with you with something like a video camera or a tape recorder. Yes, I'm old. I remember tape recorders. Anyway, you can compare what's going on inside one of those things um, with what's going on in you. So the same stimuli are being presented, the same light waves, same sound waves, same pressure, etc. And there may be similar internal states, computationally wise, not identical, but there's computation in both cases, especially if this is like a fancy camera, which is doing some stabilizing or something like that. So there's definitely internal states of the system, but presumably there's nothing that is like for the video camera to be exposed to these stimuli, whereas for you there is something that is like. And we can distinguish individual experiences in terms of what they're like for the subject, so that the experience of red is going to be different from the experience of green precisely in what it's like for the subject. So this is just a way of talking about um, the initial set of data that seems accessible from the inside, so to speak. Now, phenomenal consciousness is just a label. I've tried to give you some idea of how to zero in on it. But there seem to be, and I've mentioned some of these already, but there seem to be some key features which are associated with the phenomenon. So they may be all related to each other. They may be separate. I don't want to really get bogged down on that issue, but they are things which we would want to try to explain. So the first is um, what we could call first-person access. So there seems to be a difference in the way that I know about my pains from the way that you know about my pains. So the pain to me is present in my stream of consciousness from the first person point of view, and to you it's not. So you can have access to my behavior, you can see how I'm acting, and you can infer from that what my mental state may likely be. You may do a brain scan on me and see which areas are relatively active compared to other areas before the pain report, etc. But you can't access the pain in the way that I can. So I have a first person access to it. Um, you could call that introspection if you wanted to. It doesn't really matter. The point is that there's a particular way of knowing about the things from the inside. Knowing what it's like. You have access to what it's like from my point of view. That's distinct from what you can access from your point of view. Now, of course, obviously, you have access to your point of view. My point here is that you don't have access to mine. So related to that is the notion of subjectivity, which you could say in a way indicates that these phenomenally conscious states exist only for the subject. But really there's a little bit more to it than that. And that's that it seems, at least at first attempt, that these phenomenally conscious states, phenomenal properties, what it's like for you, these things can only really be understood from the first person point of view. So that's what I was kind of getting at when I said you don't understand what pineapple tastes like until you've actually tasted it. So no amount of description of the properties of pineapple is going to allow you to know what pineapple tastes like, even if someone tries to compare it to various other things. Well, it's kind of like an orange in the citrusy aspect, but in the flavor respect, it's different. And so you could try to give this comparison to a bunch of other things, but until you've tasted it, then you go, oh, that's right, that's what pineapple tastes like. So it seems as though there's something, and I'm not saying this is true, it's just something that people have pointed out, which seems to be the case, and that we can discuss if people want. But there seems to be something which can only be grasped from the first person point of view and would be left out of the third person point of view. So famously, Nagel, who we previously mentioned, tried to make this point by talking about the experience of the bat. So, suppose that you believe that bats have a kind of conscious experience. Many people do, although we can debate that. we'll come to these kind of questions later, I think. But suppose you think the bats are conscious. They feel things. There's something that it's like to be a bat. Um, okay, so that's interesting. But what is it like to be a bat? Well, I can kind of imagine what it would be like for me to be a bat and try to use echolocation, maybe. But that's not what it's like for the bat. The bat has a very different cognitive architecture. The bat is not, a human as a bat. The bat is a bat. So, what is it like for that kind of creature with those concepts and that approach to the world? It's not something that we can really understand, even though we can get a full grip on how the bat's brain works, or at least that's what many people think. That's certainly what Nagel thought. Um, to kind of make this seem intuitive, ask yourself the following question. So here's a bat. It's chasing a moth. The moth is flying around in the night sky, and the bat is tracking it. And there are trees and branches and lamp posts, and the bat is avoiding all those things. And of course, the bat is not using its eyes in the way that a creature like us would. The bat is echolocating, so it's emitting this high-pitched series of chirps. The sound is traveling and bouncing off these various objects and coming back, and the bat is using that to compute the location of the objects, and that's sending information to its wings, and so that's how it's navigating and avoiding the obstacles and tracking the moth which it wants to eat. We know a lot about the neurophysiology of bats. Of course, we don't know everything, but we know a lot. We can tell a whole story about it. But does that tell us what it's like for the bat? To see that it doesn't, you still have to answer the question, is the bat seeing the moth, or is it hearing the location of the moth? So, it doesn't really seem much like our seeing. And it may even be the case that the signals go not to the bat's visual cortex. That's fantastic, but why do we think that the bat's auditory cortex can't produce images? We don't know. What reason do we have to believe that the bat isn't experiencing some kind of visual sensations, which are very alien to us, maybe? Yeah, that sounds weird. But of course, light waves are hitting our eyes and causing us to have visual sensations. We don't pay much attention to the fact that it's light waves. We don't care which part of the brain processes that. The fact that this bat has its cells connected to what we call the visual part biases us to think, well, that must be where things like our vision would occur. But we have no idea what a bat's experience of the world would be like, or so many people think. So it may be the case that we can soften some of these, but these are the initial things that we would want to try to explain. Now, finally, one other property, which is a little nebulous and hard to really, all of these things are actually, but this is even more difficult to communicate in a succinct way, is the notion of intentionality. But it's a basic fundamental property and one that's very important. There's a lot you could say about this. In fact, I've recorded lectures on intentionality before. But all that I want us to know about today is that intentionality can be equated with representational states. So now, of course, we'd have to say what's the representation, and that's something maybe we'll discuss later. But the basic idea can be put very simply, and that's that when I have conscious experiences, they present the world to me, and so therefore they're about the world. They represent the way things are out there. In the 17th century, this is often thought of in terms of pictorial representation. Experiences like a picture, like an image. In contemporary times, you often hear neuroscientists say things like experiences like an immersive virtual reality created by the brain. And so the idea is that even states which don't seem like they're representational, that they're about something, really are. So take pain, for example. It's a classic case. What does pain represent? Well, okay, maybe tissue damage, and it locates the pain somewhere on your body, like you have a pain in your finger. But of course, it's been known for a long time that you could have the very same pain experience without the finger. So that's phantom limb phenomenon. And this was discussed by Descartes in the 17th century. He knew about phantom limb pain, and this was part of his argument that pains were mental. They weren't located on the body, but rather the mind represents the pain as occurring on the body, and that's why you experience it as there, but it's due to the representational features of the pain. So that's the notion of intentionality, is that the mind presents things as about things external to us. If we want to try to explain consciousness, these are the things that we want to try to explain. We want to explain. So if some people say we want to explain how these features come about, other people want to say how we know these things aren't really the way they seem. We want to explain why things seem to be this way. So there are different explanatory projects, but they're all trying to explain this set of things here. There are many other notions of consciousness which you find in the literature and which people discuss. So if you were to look into a typical neuroscience textbook and find a chapter or a section of a chapter on consciousness, the first thing they usually talk about is sleep and wake cycles and dreaming. And that's a typically normal way of talking about consciousness. When a creature is asleep, we say the creature is unconscious. If I knock you on the head and you pass out, you've become unconscious. When you wake up later, you're conscious again. So that's a standard, normal way of talking about consciousness, and that has a long history. People using the word consciousness to pick out a property that creatures have. That animal is conscious. That star is conscious. The earth is conscious. What they mean is awake versus asleep. Okay, and I'm going to come back and try to distinguish these from phenomenal consciousness in just a second. The term creature consciousness, by the way, was coined in the 90s by David Rosenthal, and it's not the only way of talking about this. People sometimes talk about arousal or vigilance or something like that, or wakefulness. I like the term creature consciousness, so there's nothing important about it. It's the phenomenon that we're interested in. So now another term that comes from Rosenthal is transitive consciousness. And he called it transitive because it's consciousness of something, and that's the transitive verb. Blah. No one cares about grammar, obviously, but this notion is trying to capture awareness. So you can be aware of something, or you can be unaware of something. And this is also a distinct concept from phenomenal consciousness, but one that, as we're going to see, all of these notions, or people have at one point or another got them confused or tried to equate them with phenomenal consciousness. Now, of course, we also have to mention self-consciousness. That's a much more complicated notion, one that we may talk about later because Joe thinks is important for the emotions. But that involves a higher level of awareness, because you're not just aware of yourself, but you have to be aware of yourself as being a self, which is a much more cognitively sophisticated sort of thing. For example, there's the famous story about the philosopher John Perry, who allegedly was looking into a kind of dirty glass window and didn't realize it, didn't realize that it was reflective surface, thought he was looking through it, and he saw this person who was kind of dressed shabbily, and he thought to himself, man, that guy needs to get a better suit or something like that. I forget exactly what he thought, but he thought something about, oh, that guy's disheveled. And it turns out that he was that guy. So he was thinking about himself when he said that guy is messy looking or disheveled. He was thinking about himself, but he wasn't thinking of himself in the same way he would be if he were looking at that same reflection and realizing it was him he was looking at, and then thought, oh, gee, I'm disheveled. There, he's thinking about himself in a way that's kind of picking out the distinctive self part of him. So that's a distinct notion from, it may involve phenomenal consciousness, but it's not the same concept. Now, of course, Bloch himself, who introduced this term, he didn't introduce the phenomenon, but he introduced the term, contrasted it with what he called access consciousness, which was a state being available for use in reasoning and flexibly guiding behavior. Access consciousness was supposed to be the thing which was missing if you're So here's Bloch's way of putting it. We have the machinery which looks like it represents things in the world, then we have the machinery of the brain which seems to be in the business of accessing or giving us a kind of access to that stuff right there. And so the issue, this is a quote from Bloch's 2007 paper, The Mesh Between Psychology and Neuroscience. And he says, quote, I changed it slightly, but he says, quote, the issue is whether the machinery of cognitive accessibility is a constitutive part of the nature of phenomenal consciousness. So whether or not phenomenal consciousness depends or necessarily involves in some way access consciousness. That's one of the fundamental issues in the neuroscience of consciousness that people are working on. There's a lot of interesting stuff going on there. And of course, if we're interested in that, I'm happy to discuss it. Related to this kind of issue is the issue of, is phenomenal consciousness rich or sparse? So here we could talk about change blindness or inattentional blindness. And, normally I would show something, but I assume people are familiar with this. If you're looking at two images and there's a change, like a statue that's flipping out in and out of existence, and you don't notice the statue consciously, so now then you might wonder what was going on when you didn't notice it. So after you do become aware of it, it's sort of obvious. And every time the images flip back and forth, you go, oh yeah, there it is, there it isn't, there it is, there it isn't. But before that, your eyes are moving around the image. You must have at least focused or foveated on the area of the image where the statue was or wasn't, and that would form a representation, have an experience in the mind, and then maybe you didn't revisit that spot immediately, so you didn't update that, so you would be having the same kind of conscious experience, or maybe you did update it, you just weren't aware of it. So there are a couple of different hypotheses, but the whole point is, some people have said, look, if you aren't aware that the thing is changing, then the way your experience actually is a lot sparser. There's a lot less detail in the quote-unquote image produced by experience than you might have typically thought. So that's another debate also associated with Bloch. It's interesting. Of course, they're related. Bloch thinks that if phenomenal consciousness is rich, then that goes against the claim that cognitive accessibility is a part of phenomenal consciousness. Whereas if it's sparse, it goes against the claim that they aren't, that they goes against the claim that they aren't connected. So it supports the claim that they are. Sorry about the confusing way that I put that. It's not clear that that's exactly right, but so that's an interesting set of questions which can be empirically addressed, it seems. Excuse me. Now, related to this is the question of what the neural correlates of consciousness are. So here, what we are wondering about is whether the prefrontal cortex in particular is a crucial component of the machinery underwrites phenomenal consciousness, or whether it's just some kind of intermediate sensory area like V4 or maybe even V1, and there's a debate about where in the brain we want to locate these phenomenal properties, which is also connected to this question of how can we empirically differentiate between various theories of consciousness. I should have added, in addition to this, that there's a robust debate on whether there are unconscious states at all. Of course, I haven't really got to that point yet, but so let's set aside these issues. This is just sort of an advertisement for some things that are going on in the science of consciousness at the current moment. But let's go back to revisiting the distinction between phenomenal consciousness and these other concepts. So let's look at first the notion of being awake versus being asleep. So my own work is very influenced by Alan Hobson's work and the way that he characterizes the difference between sleeping and waking in terms of these three parameters called the AIM or AIM model. So A is the activation in terms of fMRI, I is input-output gating, and M is modulation in terms of neuromodulators. And so you can see that this forms a kind of, these three axes form a kind of state space, and the varying states that we cycle through in wakefulness to sleep can be charted on this kind of state space. So when you're awake, high activation, um, low level of input-output gating because signals are coming in and out from the periphery with not a lot of gating. During sleep, on the other hand, and REM sleep in particular, you get activation, which returns to normals of even surpasses sometimes levels of wakefulness, but you also have high level of input-output gating and a different neuromodulatory profile. And so you can distinguish being awake and being asleep in terms of these state spaces. So I think that's a perfectly interesting idea. I'm not saying it's 100% correct or does it need to be refined. What I'm saying is this shows us that this is the distinction between being awake and being asleep is scientifically explainable pretty straightforwardly. Okay, so here's a straightforward case. Um, but we want to distinguish that from the notion of phenomenal consciousness. And so here's a couple of ways to see what I'm talking about. The first is obvious, it's dreaming. So Hobson assumes, many people assume that dreams are conscious experiences. But there's some reason for skepticism about that. For example, one reason, which I think is very interesting, is that if you go back and look at the history of dream research, what you'll find out is that before the advent of color television, color images, generally people reported that they dreamt in black and white. Whereas after the advent of color images, suddenly people are reporting that they're dreaming in color. So I think it's kind of implausible to think that the dreams actually became colored during this time. Some people have argued that rather instead, people are just misreporting the nature of their dreams. And they may be experiences that are conscious in some sense. And then when you try to recall them, you start to organize them and start to think of them. Oh, so if there was if I was being chased by a monster down the street, then there must have been this kind of imagery associated with it. And so you kind of fill it in as you recall it. Maybe not accurately, or maybe accurately, but the point is that there's the question. So having a dream is one thing. Knowing about the signature in terms of REM sleep or not is interesting, but the question that we really want to understand is what is it like in the dreams? That's really the thing that's driving all of this. If it really is like having conscious experiences, which are very similar to waking experiences, except for like their rationality and logic and so forth, then that seems to be important. If it's different, then that also seems to be important. If we can't really get a good grip on that, that also seems to be important. But that seems to be the issue, not just explaining the neural signatures, but understanding what it's like. Another case, another way of making this very same point is thinking about the vegetative state. So it's a very sad condition defined as waking unconsciousness. So someone who's in the vegetative state is awake. They have sleep-wake cycles, right? So they're going through these state spaces. They wake, they sleep, they have REM sleep even. So their brain is functioning, at least in this respect, but we don't know what it's like when they're awake but non-responsive. So is there something that it's like, maybe something very minimal, something very simple, or is it just that there's nothing that it's like for them? That's the real question. Understanding that is what a theory of consciousness seems like it should be focused on. And of course, the same can be said for the other two things here, the minimally conscious state and locked-in syndrome. Minimally conscious state is a step up from the vegetative state. So here you're waking, and you have some minimal awareness. You can maybe respond to some stimuli. Someone says, squeeze my hand. You can kind of do it, but not do a lot of other things. You're still really impaired. But what's it like for the person? Is this just, automatic non-conscious responses, or is there something that it's like for this person? So even if we locate this on the state space characterized by Hobson, it still doesn't answer the question, what is it like? And that's the one that we want answered. That's the one that theories of consciousness are hopefully aiming at. And then finally, the same can be talked about with locked-in syndrome. This is a very scary idea, but recently it's been proposed that some small subset of persons who were previously thought to be in a coma may actually be conscious, may be aware, having experience but not able to respond. So there's some fMRI data which suggests that these persons can respond to instructions. So if in the more dramatic cases, if you ask someone to imagine playing tennis, then the motor cortex responds. In persons who are truly in a coma, there's not a similar kind of response in the motor cortex. So it's almost like the person heard you say, imagine you're playing tennis, and then they tried to imagine themselves playing tennis, and as a result, the motor cortex responded. In control subjects who are healthy, asking them to imagine to play tennis, you get a robust response from the cortex, in the motor cortex. So that seems similar. But of course, the question, and so this has been touted as evidence that these people are maybe conscious. But of course, the question is, does that mean that there's something that is like for them? Or is this just a different notion of consciousness? Maybe this is just kind of non-conscious response or something like that, which brings me to the next set of distinctions. So since we started off talking about Hobson, just to finish off that discussion before moving on, consider his definition of what he calls primary consciousness, which he distinguishes from secondary consciousness. So primary consciousness, he says, can be defined as simple awareness that includes perception and emotion. As such, it can be ascribed to most mammals. And that's from his Nature Neuroscience paper in 2009. So I assume that he means that there's something that is like for these mammals to have these states. And the way to bring this out is to ask the question whether you could have simple awareness, so can there be perception and or maybe even emotion, yet there not be anything that is like for one. So as some test cases, we can think about subliminal priming. So subliminal priming is well established as a robust effect. In these kinds of cases, you present a stimulus, the subject denies that they see it. There are many ways to produce that. So it could be flash suppression or masking, forward-backward masking. So there are many different ways of doing it. The point is the subject denies that they see the stimulus, but their behavioral dispositions have been changed due to the informational content of the stimulus. So a simple example, you show them some picture of some leaves in a pile, the subject denies seeing it, but then you ask them what the meaning of a word is, and you show them the word fall, and they'll tell you it's a season, more likely than that it's a an unfortunate accident. So the picture of the leaves is somehow priming them or biasing their response towards thinking of the ambiguous word fall in terms of the meaning of the seasons as opposed to the meaning of tripping, showing that the picture must have been conceptualized to some extent as a pile of autumn leaves. So that's a lot of top-down processing. So that's interesting and there's other kinds of cases. So priming's well studied, and its effects are used in a lot of science. But the question is, suppose that when you show them the picture of the leaves, they deny seeing it, but you want to know, well, okay, phenomenally, was there anything that it was like for them to see this picture or not? Some people say yes, some people say no. And this is a way in which phenomenal consciousness may be disassociated from what we call awareness. Another way of thinking about this, so the reason I say that, by the way, is because there's a sense in which you were aware of the leaves because you formed a representation of it. The information was biasing the system. It's in the system. So you weren't consciously aware, you might think, but you were aware. So if that way of thinking about things makes sense, then it may be the case that there was nothing that it was like for you because awareness is distinct from phenomenal consciousness. Phenomenal consciousness may have something to do with awareness, but it may require more, or it may not. So this is something we're going to come back to. These cases are really more for discussion in the class, so doing it here just with myself, I already know what I think, but of course you can leave some questions in the comments if you're interested. Now, moving on, we can talk about the split brain cases, and this is, of course, something that Joe knows a lot more about than I do, having worked with these patients personally. But the basic idea is that, which is well known, is that when you sever the corpus callosum, you get a disassociation between what subjects verbally report is visible or which is information coming from the left side of the brain for the most part, and most people. So, and that therefore is tracking information on the right visual field, so they can report things over there, but things in the left visual field, which would be processed by the right brain, um, they can't report on. But yet, if you ask them to point with their hand, which is controlled by the right side of the brain, they're able to successfully point to the thing, indicating that the information is there. It's been processed. It's represented in the right side of the brain. So now there's the question, though, that is the important one, which is on the right side of the brain. Is it just a non-conscious behavioral generator, or are there phenomenally conscious experiences over there? Is there awareness? Yes, it seems like there's awareness, but is there phenomenally conscious experience as well? So I think Joe's answer is no. It's just non-conscious, and in most cases, almost every case, maybe with an exception, depending on whether the language center is on the left side of the brain or not, something like that. But other people have argued, well, no, obviously there's a phenomenally conscious experience going on over there. It's just that it can't be accessed by the speaking part of the brain. And so there's a debate that we could have there, but the debate centers on the notion of phenomenal consciousness. What is it like for the right side of the brain? And then finally, something that's more relevant to the class is the existence of unconscious fear. So you can show there's activity in the amygdala, which the subject, there's activity in the amygdala when the subject denies feeling any fear. You show them a picture of something which is scary, subliminally, they deny seeing it, but yet there's activity in the amygdala. So is that mean that they experienced fear unconsciously, that there's something that it's like for them to have that activity in the amygdala, or is this merely a defensive survival circuit, which has a job of detecting threats and being innately connected to certain behavioral patterns, such that really it's all non-conscious?
So in each case, it seems that phenomenal consciousness is the thing that needs to be explained there.
We could also see that there are various themes emerging. And so I want to turn to some of these themes now, trying to react to this problem of phenomenal consciousness as it's been presented. So one response that you might have is what I call primitivism. So primitivism is really a group of responses, but what unites them is that they all think that there's no way to give an informative theoretical account of phenomenal consciousness. So this is a view that's largely associated with the work of David Chalmers. He thinks that what the empirical sciences do is allow us to explain structure and function. So we can explain how things are built, and out of what they're built and what jobs they do. That's what the empirical sciences, according to his understanding, are in the business of doing. Phenomenal consciousness, on the other hand, seems to resist that sort of analysis. So what is it that phenomenal consciousness does? Well, think about your experience of pain or red. Just the phenomenal quality of it, the experiential quality of it, seems to be somehow separate or distinct from the job that it does. And so Chalmers likes to bring out this possibility by imagining various inversion scenarios, or what about zombies with no conscious experience? So there's a lot of things there, and I don't really want to get bogged down too much, but the basic idea is just that he wants to introduce phenomenal consciousness as a primitive notion, as something that's basic, on the order of maybe like electrons or something, as something that you have to add to the theory to make sense of all the data. And there are different ways you could do that. You could believe in epiphenomenalism, or interactive dualism, or panpsychism, or a variety of these non-physicalist views. And he's said in various places that his in principle kind of spread between these various possibilities. He's committed to the falsity of physicalism, but he is not exactly sure which of these various non-physical alternatives is most promising. So that's one version of primitivism. Here's another version of primitivism, also from philosopher at NYU. This is Ned Block's view. So he thinks, look, yeah, we're not going to get an informative theory of what phenomenal consciousness is. We have to introduce it as kind of this basic notion, but it's not going to be some non-physical basic notion. He thinks it's going to be identified with something at the neural level. So he's what he calls a biological theorist, but in the old days would have been called an identity theorist. So an identity theorist is someone who thinks that, look, here's some activity, let's say activity in V4, something like that. Bloch's favorite example is MT plus. Here's the medial temporal area, in other words. Here's this activity, and it's associated with experience of motion. So the phenomenal quality of the experience of motion is that activity. That's what it is. That's all that you can say about it. It's a brute identity. You can't explain it. And the ask for an explanation, why is experience of motion identified with that activity, Bloch says, not a legitimate question. It's like asking why is water H2O. There's no good explanation you can give except for pointing out that accepting the identity allows you to explain a whole bunch of other stuff. So the identity doesn't get explained, but it's used, the postulation of the identity is used to explain a bunch of other phenomena, like why water freezes at a certain temperature and boils at another temperature will be understandable if we know that water is H2O and H2O behaves in these various ways at these temperatures. So the identity allows us to understand some other phenomenon. And that's what Bloch thinks the case with phenomenal consciousness is. So we can't say anything more informative than that. It's identified with certain neural activity. It's introduced as a primitive, but he's not a dualist. He's a physicalist. So primitivism doesn't necessarily mean anti-science. It doesn't necessarily mean anti-physicalist. It just means anti-theoretical understanding of phenomenal consciousness. And that's one end of the spectrum. On the other side of the spectrum is what I call eliminativism. What is called eliminativism. It's not something I call. It's a widely used term. So eliminativism is the claim that consciousness doesn't exist. It's a kind of astonishing claim. There are different ways of taking it, but most prominent defender of it currently is probably someone like Dennett. And Dennett's view is often, he himself uses the analogy of a computer to make the point. He says, look, consciousness is a user illusion. So what does that mean to say it's a user illusion? Well, what it means is can be understood by thinking about the way your desktop computer functions. So on the desktop are a bunch of icons. Here's my folder containing all my PowerPoint presentations. Here's my folder with all my grading from last semester. Here's my photo album over here. And it's represented by these little icons representing that this is a folder, for example, as one, and many other things. But of course, that's not really what's going on inside the computer. There are no folders, there are no files. Instead, there's merely states of electrons in microchips, which can be interpreted as zeros and ones, which again can be interpreted as instructions for lighting up pixels on a screen. So inside the computer are no files, but it certainly is a useful way to interface with the computer, to think of it as containing these files and these folders, what's the files inside the folders. So the illusion is that what's presented on the screen, but the illusion is a useful way of interfacing with the architecture underneath, and so that's why it exists. Now, according to Dennett, consciousness is roughly similar to that. Our experience as of the world is a user illusion that the brain generates for using itself, so to speak. So it's roughly like the computer analogy, but minus the screen. There is no place where the things are printed out or pixelated in what Dennett had jokingly sometimes called figment, the mental equivalent of pigment. I guess it would also be like instead of pixels, some kind of mental pixels. So he denies those kinds of things exist, and so since that's what he thinks phenomenal consciousness is, he denies that exists. Now, in this camp also are Paul and Patricia Churchland, the Churchlands from UCSD, and of course, they're more famously associated with the denial of intentional states like beliefs and attitudes like desires and joy and pain and stuff like that. But they also take a similar view with respect to consciousness in general. So their view roughly can be stated as that these terms like pain and belief and will, power, and desire, and joy are terms from a theory, the common sense theory of folk psychology, the theory about how the mind works, which is developed by the average person, sort of codified into what we call quote unquote common sense, roughly originating from Aristotle, according to the traditional view. So this is a theory, according to the Churchlands, and is subject to confirmation or disconfirmation, revision in light of empirical evidence. And their view is that neuroscience is going to force us to revise our common sense psychology and maybe get to the point where we revise it so much that we finally say things like, oh, there is no such thing as a belief. There is no such thing as the feeling of joy. Instead, there are these computational states. Now, that's a pretty hardcore view. But you can kind of make sense of what they're trying to say. There have been terms which have been introduced to track things which haven't been turned out to be real. So, the famous example is phlogiston, but modern physics is filled with stuff like this. So, um, uh, candidates for dark matter, for example. Well, what about these particular kind of particles? Well, they've been falsified. So now we know that those things they don't exist. They're not in the way that the theory predicted they would. So this happens all the time. Theorists introduce these terms. The terms refer to something. We do some experiment. We find out, oh, well, that's not right. So we get rid of the term. So we just, it's not that we redefine it, but we get rid of it. Okay, so that's a limitivism, and they think that common sense psychology is going to be subject to that in exactly the same way. So you might want to find a middle ground between the primitivists who think that there can be no theoretical understanding of consciousness. It has to be something that's introduced primitively. And those who think that, well, no, we got to get rid of it altogether. There's no such thing as phenomenal consciousness. Can there be a happy middle ground where we want to say things like there is phenomenal consciousness and it can be explained scientifically? We can give a theoretical account of it in terms of our best science of the time. And I want to suggest that the answer is yes, we can do that. But where should we start? So there are many different sciences. Should we start with the physics, look at quantum mechanics? Some people think so. It's hard to reconcile that with physicalism. Maybe not impossible, but myself, I don't think that consciousness is going to require a level as deep as basic physics to explain. I'll say why in a second. So what about computer science? A lot of theories of consciousness were inspired by computer science in the early days. Again, I think this is the wrong place to look. As far as I'm concerned, and this is something we can discuss, I think that consciousness is a psychological phenomenon, and so it should be understood at the psychological level, whether common sense psychological, or so whether folk psychology or theoretical psychology, psychological science. I think we can have a discussion about. But I think that it's important to see that we want to understand consciousness at the psychological level, have a theory of it that invokes explicitly psychological terms, and then we can use that to look at the neural evidence and use it to adjudicate between theories of consciousness. So the brain will implement a theory of consciousness, and it will functioning of the brain will help us refine our theorizing about at the psychological level about what consciousness is. But in my view, that's the important sticking point, is that giving a theory of consciousness in neurological terms isn't going to do anything. So it may advance our understanding of how the brain works and so forth and so on. But until all of that neural functioning is interpreted at the psychological level as what is it at the psychological level, then we haven't really got a theory of consciousness yet. So that's the view that I want to defend and that we can discuss. Now, if this is the view that one has, if you're looking for a psychological notion to connect consciousness to, then I think awareness is your most natural candidate here. And we've already tried to make the case that awareness is distinct from phenomenal consciousness. So the basic idea here would be that we want to take the idea of consciousness and explain it in terms of mental functioning, which doesn't itself already invoke consciousness. So awareness is one of the things that often gets invoked. And I think that this idea is one of the fundamental ideas in our approach to understanding consciousness, that it involves a kind of awareness. But then, of course, the question is awareness of what? Awareness is always awareness of something, one might think. So here we get what I think is the fundamental split in theories of consciousness, which is that between what is called first order theories and higher order theories. So first order theories get their name from the claim that in order to have phenomenal conscious experience, all you need are representations of things in the environment. So a first order awareness is an awareness of something out there, like that dog, this chair, my wife, that cupboard, this cup. So things out there are represented by the mind. And first order theories think that that's what phenomenal consciousness is. Hobson is clearly a first order theorist of some kind. A lot of people simply assume first order theory. This is one of the things I think that needs to change about the way we do consciousness research, is to be more aware of this kind of distinction here, because many people elide it with sort of deficits here. Hobson's one of these people. So higher order theories typically claim that phenomenal consciousness consists in a higher order awareness, whereby higher order awareness, what they mean is a meta level awareness, awareness of awareness. So you have the first level of awareness, which is awareness of the things in the environment. And then the higher order theorist says, in addition to that, you need to be also aware of the fact that you are aware. So the higher order awareness of the first order awareness is what phenomenal consciousness is, according to the higher order theories. And I think that all the theories of consciousness which exist currently can be classified as either first order or higher order theories. And in fact, many of them are presented by people who are assuming some kind of higher first order theory implicitly, not explicitly, but that every theory out there can be interpreted in either way. So let's take some as examples what I think are the more promising theories. There's 5 of them, including the higher order theory. There's integrated information theory, which is associated with Giulio Tononi. And the basic idea, there's a lot of math behind here, and I'm not going to go into all the mathematical details of their idea, but the basic idea is pretty simple. So they want to start with consciousness. Tononi actually starts with some axioms about consciousness, that it's real, has cause and effect power, it does things, it's specific. And he infers from these things about the physical substrates. The most important of which is that if there's consciousness, it's got to exist from its own point of view. So what that means is that it's got to have cause and effect power. It's got to be a real thing. So what Tononi wants to do is to take a physical system like the brain and to chart out all the cause and effect relationships between every element of the brain. Now that's obviously a huge job when you're talking about something as complicated as the brain with 86 billion neurons interacting with each other. So in real life it's very difficult to do. But if you could chart out all the connections of cause and effect powers between these elements, then you could start to test each connection by seeing what would happen if you cut it. So if the system's set up in a certain way, that when you have elements A and B active, it activates element C, and then you cut out the activity of element B and wonder what happens when to C over here. If you activate A and C still activates, then B was not really required. Whereas if you activate A and then C does not activate, well then it's the combined information of A and B together which activates state C. So that seems to be something which is different, which can only be got by the elements being integrated in some sense. That's overly simplified, but I think that's the basic idea of the notion of integration. And then Tononi then wants to identify integrated information with consciousness. And that's the part where people start to balk. So someone like Chalmers, as a dualist, wants to say, look, integrated information may be a physical thing in the brain, but then it has to also be connected to some non-physical thing called conscious experience. Whereas other people, and the point that I want to make right now, whereas other people want to say, well, look, this is clearly just a first order theory of content. This may be like mental functioning, or how you have representational states, maybe to represent something in the distinctive way that mental representation represents things requires integrated information. But then you might need to have a kind of awareness of that to have consciousness. So you could have a higher order version of integrated information theory or a first order version. Tononi's way of presenting it clearly assumes a first order theory of consciousness. Um, what's interesting, though, is that I've heard scuttlebutt about town at the Center for uh, Mind, Brain, and Consciousness at NYU that Tononi's thinking about adding some higher order machinery to his postulates because he thinks that maybe phenomenologically there is a kind of higher order awareness involved in phenomenal consciousness, something that many people eventually arrive at something like this idea when they think about the nature of phenomenal consciousness. I certainly support it. But anyway, so the point here is that integrated information theory seems better suited as a mental content theory, and then needs to add some higher order awareness to it to capture something about consciousness. Now, the same thing can be said about global workspace theory. So this was introduced by Bernie Bars in 1988. His book came out, A Cognitive Theory of Consciousness. He was explicitly inspired by work in computer science, where they were trying to model linguistic understanding in terms of a bunch of unconscious modules competing for access to some kind of central space. And so he thought, well, that's what consciousness is. It's kind of use this metaphor of a stage. The stage is working memory. There's a spotlight. The spotlight is attention. So you have things on the stage in the spotlight, and the spotlight is controlled by some kind of executive behind the scenes. And there's a lot of stuff going on behind the scenes to prepare the stuff that's in the spotlight. But that's the basic idea, so that the spotlight is working memory. The stage is working memory. So what's encoded in working memory is what is conscious. And that's roughly the idea, which has been developed in further detail by Stanislaw Dehaene and his colleagues in terms of how it's actually implemented in the brain. So it turns out that there are these prefrontal cortex areas which are seemingly important for the workspace, the working memory areas that the workspace posits. And so the basic idea of the global workspace theory is that when there are representations or activity in the lower areas of the brain, like the sensory cortices, which become strong enough to propagate into the prefrontal cortex and be mobilized into the working memory, they're then available to a wide variety of systems, and that's what consciousness is, encoding in working memory. Now, closely related to that, but slightly different, is Jesse Prinz's approach, which invokes attention. So on Prinz's view, it's roughly the same idea as the global workspace theory. It's the same architecture. You have the information at the sensory levels. You have attention, which is, according to Prinz, the neural mechanism which brings these states to working memory, it makes it available to working memory. And then you have working memory in the prefrontal cortex. So Prinz's view is that you don't need to have it actually encoded in the working memory, but you just need to have attention making it available. So that's why his view is called the attended intermediate representation view. The attended part is that it's just availability to working memory. Working memory doesn't need to actually encode this information. So this is a global workspace theory and attended intermediate representation theory are very similar, with the distinction of with the debate between them being whether it's working memory or the process of getting things into working memory, which is where the contents of consciousness and what consciousness really amounts to. Now, I should say that many people think that this view has been empirically challenged by results suggesting that you could have consciousness without attention and vice versa. Now, Prinz has responded by suggesting a distinction between what he calls orientation, simply orienting towards something, and attention. So on his view, I think the way he puts it is that orienting towards something controls what information gets into the system, and attention controls where it goes. So that controls the flow of information, so that they're distinct. So there's a debate about this still. But of course, the point that I want to make, there's debate about all these. So integrated information theory, by the way, is committed to a kind of panpsychism that says that wherever there's integrated information, there's consciousness. And there can be integrated information even in very simple systems, like logic gates connected to each other. or even a brain with no activity in it, according to Tononi, will exhibit some integrated information because it deals with possible states, not what the state of the actual state is. So again, global workspace theory has come under criticism because there seem to be states which are globally available in this way but are not conscious, um, and states which are conscious but not globally available. So there's a lot of debate about what's going on here. But the point that I'm not making here is not really to try to knock these theories down, but to point out that the way they're presented assumes a kind of first order view, but you could have a higher order interpretation of each one of these theories. In fact, when I asked Jesse Prinz at a conference one time, when you attend to a representation, are you conscious of that representation? Does it make you aware of it? He said, yeah, I think so. David Rosenthal objected that, well, attention is not a way of being aware of something. We either by thinking or perception are the main ways we become aware of something. So there's a debate there, but I think that really you can interpret the Jesse's view as a kind of higher order view. At the psychological level, what we're doing is talking about awareness of these inner representations. But you could also not interpret it that way. So I think that each one of these views has to argue against a higher order view if they want to maintain the first order view, and this is something not often recognized. Now, since we're talking about attention and higher order theories, I'll mention Michael Graziano's attention schema view. It's distinct from all these other views, but it does involve intention. So I think his basic idea is that consciousness involves the brain's model of what it's attending to. So there's attention, which is controlling the flow of information, and then the brain is trying to keep track of what it's attending to, and that's the attention schema, which is a representation of what you're aware of. And to me, this really is a way of making the attention view into a kind of higher order view that emphasizes attention as opposed to something like perception or thoughts. So I think that's interesting. Now, finally, I'll just mention predictive coding, which is getting a lot of attention lately. Here's a couple of philosophers who have been really preaching the virtues of predictive coding theories, and that's Andy Clark on the left and Jacob Howie on the right. And predictive coding is, based on the work of Carl Friston and a lot of other people. The basic idea is that there's this Bayesian kind of prediction that the brain is interested in doing, that's getting these sensory signals coming in from the outside, and what it's doing is trying to predict what those sensory signals will look like. So there are predictions coming down from the top, from the higher areas of the brain, predicting what the sensory input at the lower levels will look like, and then the sensory input is come in, the two are compared. The difference between the two is what's called a prediction error. And so the idea is that the brain is trying to minimize the prediction error that it makes. It's trying to accurately model or predict what the incoming sensory input would be. And the idea is that this happens at a lot of different levels in the brain. And because of that, I think it's better thought of as a candidate for mental content. So I think predictive coding and integrated information theories are very well suited to help us try to understand what it means for the brain to represent, what it means for the mind to represent, how representations are instantiated in the brain. All of those things, I think, are circling around the same issues. But there are areas where predictive coding is going on, but consciousness doesn't seem to be involved. So what is it that makes this kind of stuff conscious? Well, there I think you need to have a higher order view. By the way, I'll just mention that predictive coding has got a lot of people coming around to it. So there's Anil Seth there, and also Alan Hobson recently just wrote a paper saying that, yes, a lot of the stuff that he's been trying to talk about with respect to dreams and consciousness, predictive coding captures. So predictive coding, I think, is important. There's actually a big conference coming up in May at the NYU Center for Mind, Brain, and Consciousness. Talking about predictive coding. Andy Clark will be there. David Heeger will be there. A couple other, those are there's a couple people for it, a couple people against. So anyway, predictive coding is very important, but doesn't seem to be a theory of consciousness. Seems to be a theory of content. So in each case, it seems like, well, what we want to do is know why this activity is conscious. And higher order theories offer an explanation for that. You can have those predictive coding states when they're unconscious because you're not aware of the information that they're predicting or coding. Where you can have predictive coding states that are conscious because you are aware of yourself as being in those states. So that's what basic idea of the higher order theory is, that consciousness. So there's one level of the mind which is involved in representing the external environment. And there's another level of mind which is involved in representing the internal environment, and that's the level at which phenomenal consciousness, in the sense that we've been talking about, appears according to the higher order theory. Now, traditionally, this is taking the form of higher order perception, and it certainly is suggested by things that have been said by famous philosophers in history, like, for instance, when John Locke says that consciousness is the perception of what passes in a person's mind. It certainly sounds like he's saying that consciousness involves a kind of perception of what's going on. Now, people who work in early modern philosophy dispute these views and say that we're reading too much of our own time period into what's going on back then. That may be the case. I don't know. But certainly, when, as a person who's reading this in the modern period, yeah, you go, aha, it sounds like these guys are talking about inner sense. I mean, they're always mentioning inner sense. Kant, in fact, they're always mentioning inner sensations. Kant coins the terms inner sense. So higher order perception theories were popular in the early 60s or 70s and 80s, but the more we learn about the brain, the less they were popular, because we haven't found any kind of inner sense organ. In fact, their biggest offender, William Lycan, recently said, well, you know what we've actually discovered is that the so-called inner sense organ is attention. And so attention is really the thing which we inner higher order perception people have been talking about. And then it just reduces to the attention views that we've been earlier discussing. So whereas higher order perception views are not very popular, higher order thought theories are very popular, and they were introduced by David Rosenthal. And he was one of these persons who was interested in consciousness early on, before it was really popular, but has done a lot of work making his view empirically tractable. So the basic idea of the traditional higher order thought theory is that it proceeds in a couple steps. The first is that what consciousness is being aware of yourself, kind of having an inner awareness, and that inner awareness is a thought. So if you're not aware of the state in any way, then there's nothing that it's like for you. There's no phenomenal consciousness. That's the transitivity principle as understood by David Rosenthal. And higher thought theories have faced some traditional kinds of problems. So early on, people said, well, what about things like rocks? This is something that I experienced when I was an undergraduate, just as a personal report. When I was an undergraduate and I first heard about the higher order thought theory, I read this paper saying that a conscious mental state is one that I am aware of myself as being in. By having a thought, I am in this state. I thought, what's this guy talking about? I'm thinking about that dog over there. It doesn't make the dog conscious. I'm thinking about this Socrates and what he said to Plato. It doesn't make Socrates conscious. I'm thinking about the lake over there. It doesn't make the lake conscious. So this actually was developed in the literature as an objection. Why is it that when we have this particular kind of thought about a mental state, it becomes a conscious mental state, but when I think about a rock, the rock doesn't become conscious? The response that was often given was that rocks are not mental, and that the higher order thought theory is a theory of how mental states become conscious. And people were always puzzled by that response. Well, what do you mean? Why does that matter? So Bloch amended the objection in the 90s to being states of your liver. He says, look, if I had thoughts about the states that my liver was in, that doesn't make them conscious. So there seems to be this mystery about how taking the unconscious state, that is the first order state, and then having an unconscious state, which is a higher order thought, changes, so those two things together somehow combine to make the first order state into a conscious state. That seems to be a bit of a mystery on the traditional higher order view. Also, on the traditional view, there's a problem about misrepresentation. So suppose the first order state represents that the world has a blue object in it, whereas the higher order state represents that you're seeing a red object. So what is it like for the person? Is it like what the first order state says, that there's a blue experience? Well, then the higher thought isn't really explaining anything. What about, is it like what the higher thought says? Is it like red? Well, then the first order state isn't saying anything. So it's the structure was supposed to be that the higher thought makes the first order state conscious, but if they don't match in their content,
then you have this interesting problem. Of course, there are responses to this. I'm going to offer one in a second, but it's interesting to think about radical misrepresentation. So there's a first order state that's representing blue. You represent it as you seeing red. That's one thing. What about when there's no first order state of the right kind at all? So um, Rosenthal often appeals to the notion of dental fear here, and this is something that I've researched quite a bit and actually talked to some dentists and read papers on this because I think it's so interesting. But it certainly is the case that there is this phenomenon that when a person is anesthetized, they will often report feeling pain. So now you have to think about what's going on. The nerve is completely deadened with the Novocaine, so the pain, there can't be the first order state of pain generated in the normal way because the receptors are blocked. What isn't blocked though is the sensation of vibration and the feelings of hot and cold. So they feel the vibration, they feel the cold, they hear the sound of the drill, they're very nervous, and so they interpret all of that as pain. And they're aware of themselves as having a pain. So one way of interpreting this is that there is no first order pain state because the nerve is blocked. They have a higher order awareness of themselves as being in pain, and so they consciously experience pain. Um, if you explain to these people that they can't be feeling pain, then they still remember the past pain that they had, but you go back to drilling and they experience the things differently so that their cognitive understanding, it shapes the way that they were experiencing the thing. But in the original case, if there was no pain state around at all, there's a vibration state, but not a pain state, but you're representing that vibration state as being a pain state, then you consciously experience pain. Okay, so in response to these kinds of issues, what I have argued is that there are really just two different ways of thinking about the higher order theory, and the one that is that will these objections are objections to this traditional view that it's the first order state being made conscious. But in fact, that's not the only way to think about the higher order view. So let me introduce. This will be where we'll end and have our discussion. So let me introduce the other way of thinking about it. So on the one hand, let's just agree that there are things out there in the world, and there's something in the world called physical blue. That's a property that objects have that is probably more than likely the way they reflect light, what kind of light they reflect, what's sometimes called the reflectance profile. So when you shine white light on these objects, what frequencies do they observe, and what frequencies do they reflect? So some of that was called physical blue, and of course we call it blue because it produces blue experiences, color experience in us, but it's just a physical property. So there's that out there in the world. That interacts with us and causes a representation of the physical property. And so that's got to be at least partially conceptual because you conceptualize it as blue. But it may also have a non-conceptual component. That's something which I'm open to but not committed to. So it's a question that we can discuss if you want. But let's certainly, many people think there are both of these components, the conceptual representation of blue and also the qualitative non-conceptual representation of blue. So this is all happening at the unconscious level now. And this would be enough for you to be primed to disambiguate an ambiguous term like blue in terms of the color instead of blowing wind. He blew air through his nose as opposed to the color blue. So if I subliminally showed you this physical blue stimulus and you denied seeing it, yet you'd be biased to say blue color, not blue action with wind. So the information was there, even the fact that it was blue conceptualized. Okay, so that's that. Now, according to the higher order view, in order to have a conscious experience of seeing blue, you need to have a higher order representation of that. In other words, you need to represent that you're seeing blue. And this is where the higher order thought is. So the higher order thought is about the first order state, but it makes it appear the blue is out there. So that's the way it typically appears when you're just having ordinary experiences. The blue is on the shirt, it's on the table, it's in the sky. But you're doing that by being aware of the fact that you're seeing blue, that you're representing this property in the external environment. So that's the higher order thought view, the way I interpret it. And we want to distinguish our various senses of consciousness. So the target of the higher order state is the lower order state. In this case, this qualitative conceptual representation of a blue thing in the environment. That's the state which I'm targeting. But phenomenal consciousness is a matter of what it's like for me. And what it's like for me is determined by the content of the higher order thought. So this is what I call the higher order representation of a representation view, or the horror view. And on the horror view, phenomenal consciousness is associated with the higher order thought, not the first order state. So the way I interpret it is that there is an aspect of this which can be called the subjective character, following people like Uriah Kriegel and others. The subjective character can be thought of as the component of the phenomenal consciousness, which is the same between all phenomenally conscious experiences. So when I have a pain or see blue, there's something which is the same there, and they're my experiences. They're for me. Whereas what's different is the actual phenomenal character, the phenomenal qualities which are presented, the seeing blue versus the feeling pain. That's determined by the conceptual content of the higher order state. Now, if you wanted to talk about what the qualitative character was, you could call that a property of the first order state, or you could just be a full-on representationalist about the first order state and deny that there is any qualitative character. But either way, this kind of view is representationalist about phenomenal consciousness. Phenomenal consciousness is completely and totally explained by the higher order state, such that even if the first order state were missing, you would have the same phenomenally conscious experience. So that's the horror view. A mental state is phenomenally conscious only if it appropriately makes one aware of oneself as being in some first order mental state. So the idea is that these higher order states represent that you have this mental life with all of these properties in it, and that's what phenomenal consciousness is higher order awareness. So what's interesting about this, I think, is that it lets us capture a lot of the things that first order theorists say, but also exploiting the resources of higher order theory. So on this view, a phenomenally conscious mental state is one which makes me aware of being in a world-directed first order state. And I need not be aware of myself as being in this higher order state. So there may be a third order state, or there may not be a third order state. And this captures a kind of claim that is often made by first order theorists that consciousness is, first of all, kind of transparent. I see through it to the world. But also, secondly, that phenomenal consciousness doesn't require any other kind of awareness. There's a kind of awareness which is associated with phenomenal consciousness, but it's a kind of intrinsically joined thing. And that comes out of this higher order approach. Because when I typically have conscious experiences, I'm not aware that I do. I'm aware of the first order states as belonging to me and being about the world, but I'm not aware of myself as being thus aware. So it allows us to kind of join the best of both worlds, or so I often like to think. Now, of course, there's a lot of more to say about this. I think there's a lot of empirical work which supports the horror view, and I've talked about that in a lot of my other presentations and papers and so forth, so I'll kind of leave that for future discussion.